Have you seen the movie Minority Report? If you have, you remember its change called precogs are able to predict future acts. And as a result, you can be arrested for the murder you're about to commit, not the one you've already committed. They, whoever they are, know what you're going to do before you even do it. Married to that is a universal identification system using retina scans that links to a giant database that remembers everything about you. When you go into a store, the holographic welcomers happily chirp, "Welcome back, Mr. Rosenzweig. Will you be looking for another pair of shoes today?" They also know everything you've ever done in your life. You really do have a permanent record. The image is, in a word, horrifying. It portrays a world where everything about you is known and where your future actions can be predicted with accuracy. It's the world of George Orwell's 1984 made real by advanced technology. Now, it's a myth, of course, but nobody is sure for how much longer. Today, we call this phenomenon the problem of big data. Every click you take in cyberspace can be tracked. Your cell phone broadcasts your geolocation constantly, and all your purchases and phone calls are cataloged somewhere. Taken together, this information can be analyzed to paint a picture of you, one that increasingly others can see, and the result is a loss of privacy. In today's lecture, we begin a two-part discussion of how this is happening and what it means. In this first lecture, I want to mostly tell you about the idea of big data and show you some examples of how it works. In the next lecture, we'll talk about privacy laws and how we might go about reclaiming some privacy for ourselves. So what exactly do we mean by big data? Well, in an increasingly networked world, personal information is widely collected and widely available. As the storehouse of data has grown, so have governmental and commercial efforts to use this personal data for their own purposes. Commercial enterprises target ads and solicit new customers. Governments use the data to, for example, identify and target previously unknown terror suspects, to find what are called clean skins who are not in any intelligence database. Discovered that we can link together individual bits of data to build a picture of a person that is more detailed than the individual parts. If you want to think about this, think of a tile mosaic or a pointillist painting by Seurat. Each bit of color by itself isn't much, but you put them all together and you can see a complete picture. We call this growth in the amount of data available, married to the increase in analytical capability, the phenomena of big data. Now, clearly, big data offers all kinds of opportunities to those who have access to it. Yet this new capability also comes at a price: the peril of creating an ineradicable trove of information about innocent individuals. If the government collects data to build a picture of, say, an unknown terrorist threat, it can also, if it's minded to, use it to build a picture of its political opponents. That sort of use of cyberspace poses threats both in America and, perhaps even more so, in authoritarian nations abroad. In thinking about this capability and the opportunities and threats it presents, we sometimes talk out of both sides of our mouths. Back in 2004, for example, there was a significant hype surrounding the most ambitious of these new big data programs, the Total Information Awareness Program, which was known as TIA. TIA was a research program initiated by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, in the immediate aftermath of September 11. The concept was to use advanced data analytical techniques to search the information space of commercial and public sector data, looking for threat signatures that were indicative of a terrorist threat. Because it would have given the government access to vast quantities of data about individuals, it was condemned as the harbinger of Big Brother and eventually killed. Compare that condemnation with the universal criticism of the government for its failure to connect the dots during the Christmas 2009 bombing plot attempt by Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib. In that case, we were, it is said, not doing enough data analysis, not linking NSA intercepts to State Department reporting or to travel records. So that conflict gives you some idea of the cross currents that are at play here. The conundrum arises because the analytical techniques are fundamentally similar to those used by traditional law enforcement agencies, taking a lead and finding connections, but they operate on a much more vast set of data, and that data is much more readily capable of analysis and manipulation. As a result, the differences in degree tend to become differences in kind. To put this issue in perspective, just consider a partial listing of relevant databases that might be targeted: credit cards, telephone calls, criminal records, real estate purchases, travel itineraries, and so on. The technological reality is that all of that information is available somewhere in cyberspace, and it's easy for others to access, even though the average citizen probably thinks that his or her credit card records and web surfing habits are private. This is a fundamental change caused by technological advances that, like King Canute's fabled tide, cannot be stopped or slowed. The phenomenon derives from two related yet distinct trends: increases in computing power and decreases in data storage costs. Most of you have seen with your own eyes the steady increase in the power of computers. It's best expressed in Moore's law, named after Intel computer science scientist Gordon Moore, who first articulated the law back in 1965. Moore's law predicts that computer chip capacities will double every 18 to 24 months. Moore's law has been remarkably accurate for nearly 30 years. The effect of routine doubling is so great that we have to graph it logarithmically, where each step up the y-axis shows an increase by a factor of 10. In practice, what this means is that processor capacity today is more than 1,000,000 times greater than in 1970. The power of this processing capacity translates almost directly into processing speed. It is what drives the information technology tools that power Google and Amazon and what makes Walmart's purchasing system a reality. And though no one predicts that processing speed will double indefinitely, surely that's a physical impossibility, there is no current expectation that the limits of chip capacity have been reached. Married to this trend is another one: the remarkable reduction in the costs of data storage. Data storage costs have also been decreasing at a logarithmic rate, almost identical to the increases we've experienced in chip capacity, but in the exact opposite direction. What this means, in practical terms, is that while in 1984 it cost roughly $200 to store a megabyte of data, by 1999 that cost had sunk to 75 cents. And today you can buy 100 megabytes of data storage capacity for a penny. On eBay, you can frequently purchase a terabyte storage device for your desktop for less than $100. A terabyte is roughly 1 trillion bytes of data, a huge volume for storing simple alphanumeric information. Here, too, the prospects are for ever cheaper data storage. One can readily imagine peta or even exabyte-sized personal storage devices. A petabyte is 1 million gigabytes. An exabyte is 1 billion gigabytes. In 2009, the entire internet was roughly 500 exabytes of data. Yet within 10 years or so, that storage capacity may be available to a small corporation. So just imagine what a large corporation or a government could purchase and maintain. Therefore, the story of technology today requires us to answer the question: what happens when ever quicker processing power meets ever cheaper storage capacity? Anyone who uses email knows the answer to that question. No longer do you have to laboriously label, file, and tag your email in order to find it again. You now simply store all the email you want to retain, and you use a simple natural language search algorithm to pull up relevant emails from storage when needed. The storage cost of Gmail to the user is zero. Google offers it for free. And the processing time for any search request for the average individual is measured in, at most, seconds. So here is how former IBM chairman Samuel J. Palmisano put it in a speech he gave in September 2011. Quote, "We're all aware of the approximately 2 billion people now on the internet, in every part of the planet, thanks to the explosion of mobile technology. But there are also upwards of 1 trillion interconnected and intelligent objects and organisms, what we call the Internet of Things. All of this is generating vast stores of information. It is estimated that there will be 44 times as much data and content coming over the next decade, reaching 35 zettabytes in 2020. A zettabyte is a 1 followed by 21 zeros. And thanks to advanced computation and analytics, we can now make sense of that data in something like real time. This enables very different kinds of insights, foresight, and decision making." Now, our law and policy thinking hasn't caught up with this reality yet. 10 years ago, surveying the technology of the time, which by and large was 100 times less powerful than today's data processing capacity, Scott McNealy, who was then CEO of Sun Microsystems, said, quote, "Privacy is dead. Get over it." What he was describing was the loss of public anonymity, the ability to act, whether physically or in cyberspace, without anyone having the technological capacity to permanently record and retain data about your activity for later analysis. American law actually has a phrase to describe this phenomenon. It's practical obscurity. Derived from a 1989 Supreme Court case, Department of Justice versus Reporters Committee, the origin of the phrase is instructive in illuminating the effects of the change in technology. Back in the late 1980s, practically at the dawn of time for computers, the Department of Justice went to a great deal of trouble to create a database with information about the criminal records of known offenders. At the time, those types of records were kept in lots of disparate databases that were not connected to each other. Arrest records might be held by a local police station, charging records by a district attorney, and disposition and sentencing records by a state court. Federal records were, of course, held by still other law enforcement authorities, attorneys, and courts. All of these records were generally public and, in theory, available for inspection by the press or private citizens. But in practice, the records were so widely scattered among so many data holders that no newspaper or individual could incur the expense of finding all the information and creating a comprehensive dossier on any individual. They were, in a phrase, practically obscure. Only the federal government had the degree of need and adequacy of resources to undertake the task of creating, at great expense, the precursor of what is today the National Crime Information Center. At very great cost, the Department of Justice began the collection of criminal records on a small number of criminals, mostly prominent mafia dons, who were of national interest. The Reporters Committee case was a powerful expression of the strength of the paradigm of practical obscurity. A CBS News correspondent and a press organization filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Department of Justice, asking for the collated dossier, or the rap sheet, on alleged mafia figures. Their reasoning was, to me, quite persuasive. Since the information was all public when found in the disparate databases, it did not lose that public character when collected by the federal government. And if it was public information, then it was clearly subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act, known as FOIA. The department denied the FOIA request, and a unanimous Supreme Court, whose membership at the time included jurists ranging from liberal Justice William Brennan to conservative Justice William Rehnquist, approved the denial. According to the court, quote, plainly there is a vast difference between the public records that might be found after a diligent search of courthouse files, county archives, and local police stations throughout the country, and a computerized summary located in a single clearinghouse of information, end quote. Because of that difference, the court concluded that the, quote, privacy interest in maintaining the practical obscurity of rap sheet information will always be high. Today, the court's confident assertion that obscurity will always be high has proven to have a half-life of less than 20 years. Large data collection and aggregation companies with names like Experian and ChoicePoint hire retirees to harvest by hand public records from government databases. Paper records are digitized and electronic records are downloaded. These data aggregation companies typically hold birth records, credit and conviction records, real estate transactions and liens, bridal registries, and even kennel club records. One company, Axiom, estimates that it holds on average approximately 1,500 pieces of data on each adult American. That's you. Since most, though not all of these records are governmental in origin, the government has equivalent access to the data. And what they cannot create themselves, they can likely buy or demand from the private sector. The day is now here where anyone with enough data and sufficient computing power can develop a detailed picture of any identifiable individual. The picture might tell your food preferences or your underwear size. It might tell something about your politics or your friend's friend's politics. Remember the 1993 New Yorker cartoon by Peter Steiner that we talked about in Lecture 3? The one that depicted a dog seated at a computer and telling a fellow canine, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog? Well, today, as one observer has said, they not only know you're a dog, but they know your favorite leash color and whether or not you've been neutered. It's all in some pervasive database somewhere. So what does all this mean in practice? And how does it work? These systems of data analysis are remarkably technologically sophisticated. They are, in the end, an attempt to sift through large quantities of personal information to identify subjects whose identities are not known, or in the commercial context, these individuals are called potential customers. In the world of global activism, they might be called anonymous, or Russian patriotic hackers. In the terrorism context, they're often called cleanskins, individuals who are dangerous because nothing is known of their predilections. For precisely this reason, this form of data analysis is sometimes called knowledge discovery, as the intention is to discover something previously unknown about an individual or group of individuals. So let me give you a few examples to illustrate the point. Probably the best place to start is with the 9/11 attacks. By now, everyone has heard that they happened because we couldn't connect the dots. But what exactly does that mean? Well, at bottom, it means that the government didn't use big data. Here's how it should have worked, but didn't. In short, as a Department of Defense Review Committee concluded, with just 7 clicks of the mouse through existing public databases, all 19 terrorists could have been identified and linked to each other. 2 of the terrorists made reservations on American Airlines Flight 77. Their names were also on the CIA's watch list for terrorists in the United States. But we didn't connect those 2 pieces of information. If we had, we would have learned that the 2 addresses they gave to the airline and a simple cross-check would have found 3 other terrorists, including the infamous Mohammed Atta, who also made reservations for flights on September 11th and who also used those 2 addresses. Now, if we also cross-checked the callback phone numbers that Atta gave to the airlines, we would have found another 5 terrorists who gave the same phone number to the reservation agents and also made flight reservations for September 11th. Yet another terrorist would have been identified because he used the same frequent flyer number as one of the other men on the list. And two more were in public databases like the Yellow Pages and listed as sharing living arrangements with one of the terrorists. Finally, the remaining 6 terrorists could have been identified by links to a different list, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service's expired visa illegal entry list. One of those terrorists was on the list, and the other 5 had public records of having lived with him or with each other. And all, of course, shared this common characteristic of making reservations on flights for the morning of September 11th. In short, as a Department of Defense Review Committee concluded, with just 7 clicks of the mouse through existing public databases, all 19 terrorists could have been identified and linked to each other. The story of Raed Albania, a Jordanian who attempted to enter the United States at Chicago's O'Hare Airport on June 14, 2003, is another powerful illustration of how big data can be used. And this time, it was a success. In some ways, it shows how much changed in just 2 years. Albania was probably a clean skin, a terrorist with no known record at all. He was carrying a valid business visa in his Jordanian passport and on the surface appeared to be an unremarkable business traveler from the Middle East. The Department of Homeland Security operates a sophisticated data analysis program called the Automated Targeting System, or ATS, to assess the comparative risks of arriving passengers. They use ATS to decide who to stop and talk to and who to let through easily. The system is essential, given the sheer volume of travelers to America. In a typical year, approximately 350 million people cross American borders. More than 85 million of those arrived by air. Since over 350 million individuals cannot obviously be subject to intense scrutiny, some form of assessment and analysis must be used to make choices about how and when to conduct inspections. ATS is that system. ATS flagged Albania for heightened scrutiny. He was pulled from the main line of entrance at O'Hare and individually questioned. During the interview, Albania's answers were inconsistent and evasive, so much so that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection officer who conducted the interview decided to deny his application for entry and ordered him returned to his origin point. As a matter of routine, Albania's photograph and fingerprints were collected before he was sent on his way. Now, there this story might have ended, since CBP officers reject entry applications daily for a host of reasons. But Albania proved an unusual case. More than a year later, in February 2005, a car filled with explosives drove into a crowd of military and police recruits in the town of Hilla, Iraq. More than 125 people died, the largest death toll for a single incident in Iraq until that time. The suicide bomber's hand and forearm were found chained to the steering wheel of the exploded car. Why they were chained is a fascinating question of psychology. When the fingerprints were taken by U.S. military forces, a match was found to the fingerprints taken from Albania 20 months earlier in Chicago. Most similar successes are not made public. Often the factors that form part of the analysis cannot be revealed, and success in identifying terrorist suspects, or in other contexts, members of a criminal organization, would be negated by disclosure of the success. Only Albania's death made his case fit for public disclosure. So now let's change our focus from counterterrorism to the power of big data to reveal personal information and patterns. David McCandless of London created a chart based on research which used sophisticated computer programs to scour the web and scrape bits of data from a lot of sources. For obvious reasons, we call these web crawling programs spiders. McCandless's chart represents hundreds of thousands of data points displayed graphically. It represents an annual human activity, and it shows a large peak in spring and another peak toward the end of the year. So, what is this activity? Why don't you take a guess? I'll tell you some things that it's not. For example, it's not the frequency with which we watch sporting events, even though the college basketball, March Madness, and fall football seasons occur near the time of the activity peaks. It's not greeting card buying either, though the peaks are near Easter and Christmas. So what is it? What is a human activity that occurs most frequently in March and then again around the Thanksgiving Christmas holiday season in the US? If you want, pause the lecture for a second to think about it, and then start it up again when you want to continue. Go ahead. We'll wait for you. Ready? Here's the answer. Facebook breakup data. It's a graph about how love ends, at least among Facebook users. The big peaks are for spring break and the holidays. There are even small peaks on Mondays, since people usually break up over the weekend and report it to their Facebook friends on Monday. This is pretty amazing stuff. It's really knowledge discovery, a pattern we would not see without big data. It's kind of exciting, or from a different viewpoint, maybe disturbing. And it's also why Facebook is worth billions of dollars. They are collecting information about you that you voluntarily provide and using it to build a picture of who you are. That picture is worth money to them and to other people. I don't know about you, but to me, it's sometimes a little spooky how accurate the Google ads are that show up on my system. They really do seem to know what I'm thinking. So let's try another example. I have a little program on my computer called Collusion. You can run it on your own computer if you want, provided you use Firefox as your web browser. What the program does is simply watch as you browse the web and then keep track of how your browsing habits are being collected. See, what you probably don't know is that when you go to a particular website, well, say Google, that website shares your visit with lots of other websites. It colludes with them, if you will, to build a better picture of who you are. A snapshot of my own recent web browsing shows a field of dots, each one representing a different website. If I hover over the dot that represents Google, I can see that Google shares my browsing history with more than 20 other websites. Some of those, like Facebook, are other sites that I actually use. But several of them, like Hot Air and Daily Caller, are places I never go. And there are even some, like Cornell.edu, that make me wonder. I have absolutely no idea why they're connected to Google. But there you go. This picture is a graphic example of how my personal web browsing history is being converted into information about me. So ask yourself this: did you realize how much of your browsing history is public? Did you know that the places you go actually broadcast that fact to other folks on the web? You can see how that, too, is a bit creepy. Of course, in other contexts, what seems only a bit creepy can become pretty scary and downright authoritarian. Here's a final example. Your cell phone is constantly reporting your location to the nearest cell towers. That's how the system knows where you are, so it can connect a call to you. When I go to visit my grandchildren in Evanston, Illinois, my cell phone checks in with the local cell towers, and so the cell service provider knows that I'm not near my home in Washington, D.C. That's a perfectly sensible idea. Otherwise, cell phone service wouldn't work. But the company keeps those records of where your cell phone is, and that means they know not only where you are, but where you've been. A German politician created a video from his cell phone records that shows a 6-month log of all his movements. He put it together to make a point. Because most of where we go is innocuous. But if I have 6 months of your travel logs, I'll know if you're a churchgoer, or a gym fanatic, or if you visit local porn shops. They say that you are what you eat, but really and truly, you are where you visit. Now, maybe you're not worried that your phone company knows all this. But what if they sell it to some commercial advertiser? Or what if the government issues a subpoena and collects all those records. The issue is highly contentious right now, and we'll talk more about it in the next lecture. But at the present time, the Miller-Smith third-party doctrine applies. That's the doctrine that says that information you share with a third party, like Facebook or your phone provider, is not protected by the Fourth Amendment. And that means that you have no privacy interest in the location data that you voluntarily broadcast to the cell phone company. That's a pretty odd definition of voluntary, to be sure, but there it is. And so that's our introduction to the world of big data and how your actions are being watched in cyberspace. Whether we like it or not, the phenomena is here to stay. The only question is when and how we can monitor and control the use of these techniques so that we get the benefits of the growth in data and analytics without the potential harms to privacy and civil liberties. We can do that subject of our next lecture. We look at the phenomena of big data, the one we discussed in the last lecture, and all we see are new technologies that are going to collect more data and analyze it more quickly. In the end, it looks like our current conceptions of privacy will be eroded, if not destroyed. So what are we going to do about it? In this lecture, I want to talk about where our privacy laws come from, how we got to where we are today, and what, if anything, we might think about as a way of changing the privacy laws without being complete Luddites about the new technology. So we're going to break this discussion into two parts. First, talking about the government's use of big data, and then talking about the private sector's commercial use of big data. And we'll end with a closely related topic, how big data analysis also can be used against the government itself to keep it honest. So let's begin with what, to me, is pretty obvious, though I caution you that some people disagree with me. In my judgment, our current privacy rules are simply not up to the task. They are, to a very real degree, antique, relics of the last century. The relevant Supreme Court precedents date from the 1970s. Is it any wonder that the current structure of law does not match the technological reality? As we saw in the last lecture, the third-party doctrine was developed by the Supreme Court in two cases, United States versus Miller and Smith versus Maryland, back in the 1970s at the dawn of the computer era. It means that information you disclose to a third party is not protected by the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. In the context of data privacy, this means that there is no constitutional protection against the collection and aggregation of your cyber data, credit card purchases and the like, for purposes of data analysis and piercing the veil of anonymity. Now, there's some hope that this constitutional status quo might change. In January 2012, the Supreme Court considered a case by the title United States versus Jones. And full disclosure here, I did some work on Jones's side of the case. The case involved the decision by some federal agents to put a GPS tracking device on Jones's car. Do you remember the German politician we talked about in the last lecture? The one who produced a video of how his cell phone was tracked? The Global Positioning System, or GPS tracker, works in the same way, except it is a device that's independent of your phone. In this case, the agents attached the GPS tracker to Jones's car because they suspected he was a drug dealer. Sure enough, they tracked him to a drug stash house, and eventually he was convicted. But the agents had made a mistake. Maybe. They hadn't gotten a valid warrant to put the tracker on the car. Now, the government's argument was simple. Cars travel on public roads are exposed to the public, so Jones had no expectation of privacy in his travel, and therefore no warrant was needed. If you believe in the third-party doctrine, this was an easy case. But Jones won, 9-0. 5 justices thought that he should win on a very narrow and limited ground. That is, that in putting the GPS on his car, the federal agents had actually trespassed on his property, and that trespass required a warrant before they could do it. But 4 of the justices would have decided the case on a much broader ground. They would have said that the collection of large volumes of data, what we called the big data problem, raises constitutional issues because it allows the collection of enough data to create a mosaic picture. As we said in the last lecture, this mosaic allows us to piece together individual bits of data about Jones's life to develop a revealing picture of who he is. Now, to be sure, in this case, the picture indicated that he was a drug dealer. But in other cases, the technology might have been used to determine whether he was a Democrat or a Republican. Obviously, this type of rule would require some line drawing. How much data is enough to create an impermissibly large mosaic? Nobody knows. And the majority of the court didn't answer the question. But one thing we can say for sure is that the Supreme Court is thinking hard about how the standard Fourth Amendment analysis applies in the era of big data. For now, however, officially, the court and the Constitution are still on the sidelines. So all that's left to protect anonymity from government intrusion are the statutory protections created at the federal level by Congress. But those too are out of date. Our concepts of privacy are embedded in a set of principles known as the Fair Information Practice Principles, or FIPS, which were first developed in the United States in the early 1970s and have now become the keystone of the Privacy Act of 1974. In brief summary, which does not do them justice for want of detail, the principles say that a government should limit the collection of personal information to what is necessary. It should use it only for a specific and limited purpose, and be transparent and open with the public in how the information is collected and used. It should also allow the individual about whom the data is collected to see the data collected about him or her and correct it if necessary. I think you can probably see the problem already. The technology of big data collection and analysis just destroys these types of rules. A conscientious and fair application of these principles is in many ways fundamentally inconsistent with the way in which personal information is often used in the counterterrorism context, or, for that matter, in the context of commercial data analysis. Recognizing this fact is not, at this juncture, to make a normative judgment, but the truth is that the way in which data analysis programs function is at odds with these principles. The automated targeting system that discovered Raid al-Banya, that's the terrorist we discussed in the last lecture, who was turned away from O'Hare Airport and later bombed a market in Iraq. That simply can't work with these types of limitations. And consider, just as an example, the purpose and use specification principle, the one that says that data collected for one purpose should not be used for another. If fully applied, this idea would make it impossible for many sophisticated knowledge discovery systems to work well. Often the data that provides the missing link and makes a previously unknown connection is information that was collected for a different purpose and intended for a different use. To take the most prosaic example, recall our discussion in the last lecture about the 9/11 hijackers and how big data might have been used to foil their plot. Ordinarily, a phone number is collected from an air traveler when he books a flight for the purpose of allowing the airline to contact him, and his frequent flyer number is collected so that his loyalty account can be credited. The automated targeting system that we discussed in the last lecture uses those data fields for another purpose. That is, to identify potential connections between known terrorists and those who are otherwise unknown. It might have enabled us to spot the 9/11 plot before it was executed. But the way that system uses data is precisely what the purpose and use limitation principles forbid. In short, in this modern world of widely distributed networks with massive data storage capacity and computational capacity, so much analysis becomes possible that the old principles seem no longer to fit. What is needed then is a modernized conception of privacy, one with the flexibility to allow effective government action, but with the surety necessary to protect against governmental abuse. So, before we start this next part of the discussion, I have a confession to make. In most of this course, I've tried to present the facts and the information in a way that lets you decide what the right answer is. But today, we're moving into new terrain. A comprehensive new anonymity protective legal structure doesn't exist and has yet to be developed. So any answer proposed is more in the nature of a proscription rather than a description. And opinions differ wildly on how we should move forward. Some people think that the old privacy rules should just be reinforced. I tend to think that's a mug's game, and that technology is forcing change. So for the next few minutes, what I want to do is outline for you my own thoughts about a new way forward. In this view, the old idea of collection and purpose limitations yield because they can't withstand the new technology. Instead, we focus on how data is used. And more importantly, we refocus our laws so that our concern is not with use that is mere analysis, but rather with uses that constitute the imposition of an adverse consequence. So here are a couple of building blocks for this idea. First, we really need to dig deep into the idea of what we mean by privacy. Privacy is a misnomer in some respects. What it reflects is a desire for the independence of personal activity, a form of autonomy. We protect that privacy in many ways. Sometimes we do so through secrecy, which is effectively obscuring the observation of conduct and the identity of those engaging in the conduct. An example of this might be the voting booth, where who you are and what you do are both literally obscured behind a screen to create a secret environment. In other instances, we protect the autonomy directly, as for example when we talk about privacy rights in connection with freedom of religion or the right to marry whom you want. Indeed, the whole point of that kind of privacy is to allow people to act as they wish in public, which is a bit of an odd idea of privacy if you think about it. The concept of privacy that most applies to this new information technology regime and to the use of big data is the idea of anonymity. It's kind of a middle ground where observation is permitted, that is, we expose our actions in public, but where our identities and our intentions are not ordinarily subject to close scrutiny. The information data space is, as we've seen, suffused with information of this middle ground sort. Bank account transactions, phone records, airplane reservations, and smart card travel logs, to name but a few. They constitute the core of the transactions and electronic signature or verification information that's available in cyberspace. The type of anonymity that one has in respect of these transactions is not terribly different from real-world anonymity. Consider as an example the act of driving a car. It's done in public, but one is generally not subject to routine identification and scrutiny. So, protecting the anonymity we value requires, in the first instance, defining it accurately. We might posit that anonymity is, in effect, the ability to walk through the world unexamined. But that's not strictly accurate. for our conduct is examined numerous times every day. Sometimes the examination is by a private individual. For example, one may notice that the individual sitting next to them is wearing a wedding ring. Other routine examinations are by governmental authorities or commercial entities. The policeman in the car who watches the street, or the security camera that records us at the bank or the airport, for example. So what we really must mean by anonymity is not a pure form of privacy akin to secrecy. Rather, what we mean is that even though one's conduct is examined routinely and regularly, both with and without one's knowledge, nothing adverse should happen to you without good cause. In other words, the veil of anonymity, previously protected by the practical obscurity that we discussed in the last lecture, is now readily pierced by technology. So instead of relying on the lack of technical ability to protect privacy, the veil must be protected by rules that limit when piercing is allowed. These rules are needed to protect our privacy and to prevent governmental abuse. So to put it more precisely, the key to my conception of privacy is that privacy's principal virtue is as a limitation on consequence. If there are no unjustified consequences, that is, if the consequences that are the product of abuse or error or the application of an unwise policy are excluded, then under this vision, there's no real effect on a cognizable liberty or privacy interest. In effect, if nobody is there to hear the tree or identify the actor, it really does not make a sound. So, what's that mean? In the government context, the questions to be asked of a data analysis program are things like this. What is the consequence of identification? What's the trigger for that consequence? Who decides when the trigger is met? These questions are the ones that really matter. And questions of collection limitation or purpose limitation, for example, are, in my judgment, rightly seen as distractions from the main point. The right answers to these questions will vary, of course, depending on the context of the inquiry. But the critical first step is making sure that we're asking the right questions. So now we've got a working definition of modern privacy. How do we protect it and its essential component of anonymity? The traditional way is with a system of rules and a system of oversight for compliance with those rules. Here, too, modifications need to be made in light of technological change. Rules, for example, tend to be static and unchanging, and they don't account readily for changes in technology. Indeed, the Privacy Act, the central statute intended to protect individual privacy against government intrusion, is emblematic of this problem. The principles of the Privacy Act